Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We have an absolutely massive stack of sources on the table today, and I am just thrilled you are joining us. If you look at what we're working with, we have historical biographical notes on 19th century London. We have specific theological frameworks drawn straight from the Westminster Confession of Faith. And, well, at the center of it all, we have a specific historic text. Today, our mission is to conduct a thorough analysis of Charles Spurgeon's lecture to his pastoral college titled The Soul Winner Qualifications for Soul Winning Manward.
Right, and if you are listening to us right now, you likely have an interest in how historical theology applies to daily Christian practice. We want to sit down with you, open up these sources, and examine what it takes to effectively communicate the truth of the gospel to another human being. To give you some context, Spurgeon previously laid out the Godward qualifications from history, focusing on what God requires and what God alone can do. Today, our investigation shifts entirely to the manward characteristics.
Yeah, these are the specific, tangible, human qualities that make a messenger effective in reaching the souls of men. We are looking at the human instrument, the actual person delivering the message.
That is a critical distinction to make right at the outset, and I think it frames everything we are going to discuss today. As Protestant Christians who adhere to the Westminster Confession, we hold firmly to the sovereignty of God in salvation. The confession is very clear in chapter 10 regarding effectual calling, that God alone is the one who regenerates the heart and grants salvation. It is entirely a work of his grace.
Spot on.
Yet the confession is equally clear that God uses secondary causes. He uses human instruments to deliver the gospel message. This creates a fascinating theological framework for our discussion today. Since God is the one who saves, well, what role does the human messenger actually play? Spurgeon's lecture answers that by investigating the precise traits that make those human instruments effective, compelling, and useful in the hands of God. God could use angels to preach the gospel, but he chooses to use flawed human vessels. Therefore, the character, tone, and manner of that vessel matter immensely.
Okay, let us unpack this right away, because you just dropped a very specific theological term, and I want to make sure everyone is on the same page. You mentioned effectual calling from chapter 10 of the Confession. For listeners who might not be seminary graduates or who are just stepping into Reformed theology, can we break that down into plain English? Give me the explain like I am 5 version of effectual calling and why it sits at the center of this conversation about human qualifications.
Absolutely. Think of effectual calling like this. God extends an invitation to salvation, but it is not just a polite flyer left on your doorstep that you can easily throw away. An effectual call means God is actively working inside the person's heart, changing their desires so that they actually want to respond to the invitation. It is effective. The person willingly and joyfully accepts the truth because the Holy Spirit has made them alive to it.
So the internal work is already happening.
Precisely. Now, the human messenger is the one standing on the porch, so to speak, handing over the invitation. The messenger cannot change the heart of the person inside the house. Only God does that. But the messenger is still required to knock on the door, speak clearly, and deliver the message in a way that represents the king who sent it. Spurgeon's entire lecture is about how the messenger should stand, speak, and behave on that porch.
That sets the stage perfectly for Spurgeon's first major point in this lecture, which we might call the baseline qualification. Spurgeon is remarkably blunt here. He introduces the idea that an ignorant person, he actually uses the word ignoramus, is simply not suited for the great work of winning souls. Now, he does not say this to be cruel, but he draws a very sharp line.
He really does.
He points out that a person who only knows 2 basic facts, that they are a sinner and that Christ is a Savior, absolutely has a duty to share that basic truth with anyone in a similar condition. However, to be a teacher of others, to be entrusted with the task of guiding a congregation or leading many to the truth, one needs extensive instruction in the teachings of God. You cannot be largely used in this specific service if you are ignorant of the broader theological truths yourself.
Spurgeon is making a highly practical distinction between the duty of every Christian to share their personal testimony and the specific calling of a teacher or a minister. Every believer has a mandate to say, I was blind, but now I see. That requires no formal theological training whatsoever. It is the raw, beautiful reality of personal experience. But Spurgeon is addressing those who wish to be soul winners in a broader, perhaps vocational or highly influential sense.
Right. The people actively standing in front of a crowd.
Yes. To teach others, you must possess a wide and comprehensive knowledge of God's truth. You cannot explain the covenant of grace, the nature of justification, or the realities of sanctification if you have not studied them thoroughly yourself. True usefulness in this area requires a taught of God knowledge. It requires study, reading, and a mind that has grappled with the text of Scripture.
Before we move off that thought, I'm going to stop you again because we have more theological terminology on the table. You mentioned justification and sanctification. If we're talking about a messenger needing to understand these concepts to cure their ignorance, let us define them for the listener. What is the distinction between those two realities that a teacher needs to grasp so firmly?
That is a great catch. Justification is the legal declaration by God that a sinner is entirely forgiven and declared righteous in his sight based solely on the finished work of Christ. It is an event. It happens the moment a person believes. It's the judge banging the gavel and saying, "Not guilty." Sanctification, on the other hand, is the ongoing process that happens after justification.
The day-to-day reality.
Correct. It is the lifelong, day-by-day work of the Holy Spirit, making the believer more holy, helping them put sin to death and live in a way that honors God. A teacher must know the difference. If a teacher confuses justification and sanctification, they might accidentally tell a congregation that they have to work hard to earn their forgiveness, which destroys the gospel of grace. That is precisely why Spurgeon insists that ignorance disqualifies a person from being a primary teacher.
He illustrates this absolute need for instruction with a wonderfully simple metaphor. He says that there must be some light in the candle that is to lighten the darkness of others. The physics of the metaphor are undeniable. A candle cannot give off light if the wick is not lit, and a person cannot impart knowledge that they do not possess.
It is a brilliant image.
If the goal is to drive away the darkness of misunderstanding and sin in the minds of the hearers, the speaker must carry the light of comprehensive biblical instruction. The ignorant person, no matter how much goodwill or desire they have to do good, must be left out of the race of great soul winners. They are disqualified from entering the lists, as Spurgeon puts it, until they undergo the necessary instruction.
That candle metaphor perfectly encapsulates the Reformed view of preaching and teaching. The light is the Word of God, but the candle is the human mind and mouth that delivers it. If the mind is empty, the candle is unlit. You simply cannot make known to others what you are ignorant of yourself. This is why our theological tradition places such a heavy premium on an educated clergy and well-instructed lay teachers. The mind must be engaged.
It is not just about raw emotion.
Not at all. Spurgeon urges his listeners to ask that they may be well instructed in the truth of God, specifically so they can be able to teach others. The pursuit of knowledge here is not for academic pride. It is a utilitarian pursuit. You gather the light of knowledge so that you can shed that light on the people God places in your path.
And that actually brings up a terrifying thought. Because what happens when you have someone who does have the knowledge, whose candle is lit, but they're just reciting it like a script? Spurgeon had a real problem with that, did he not? That naturally pivots us into his second major section, which requires us to look closely at the authenticity of the messenger.
Yes, this is where it gets very challenging.
He transitions to the absolute necessity of evident sincerity. It is not enough to simply hold correct doctrines in your head or even to speak them accurately. The hearer must see, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the speaker genuinely believes the doctrines they are proclaiming. Sincerity must be manifest at once to anyone who looks for it. If the audience suspects for even a moment that you are proclaiming something you do not fully believe yourself, the work will have no effect. You must escape what we might call the actor's trap.
The anecdote Spurgeon provides here is devastating in its simplicity. He recounts a conversation about a good sermon. A listener is asked if the minister preached a good sermon, and the listener agrees that the words spoken were very good. Yet, when asked if they profited from it, the listener replies that they gained absolutely nothing. The explanation is the core of Spurgeon's warning. The listener states that the preacher was viewed merely as an actor performing a part.
Wow. Just an actor.
Yes, the audience member did not believe the preacher actually felt what he was preaching, nor did the preacher seem to care whether the audience felt it either. The words were orthodox, the doctrine was sound, perhaps even perfectly aligned with the Westminster Confession, but the delivery was entirely heartless.
That phrase, an actor performing a part, is such a strong indictment. Think about what an actor actually does. They study a script, they learn the motivations of the character, they put on a costume, and they manufacture an emotion for a designated period of time. But when the curtain falls, they go back to being themselves. The message was never their true reality.
It is entirely artificial.
Spurgeon issues an intense warning about this kind of behavior in a religious setting. He says that when preaching becomes a matter of routine or form, it sinks into a theatrical performance. And he does not mince words about how God views this. He calls it a mockery of divine truth, a caricature more worthy of the devil than of God. Divine truth is far too precious to be treated as a script in a play. The listeners are perceptive. As soon as they suspect the speaker is insincere, they will listen with disgust. They cannot separate the careless messenger from the message, no matter how hard they might try to feed on the truths being offered.
Spurgeon offers a stark, even shocking alternative to this kind of theatrical religion. He says it would be far better to return to secular business. He specifically mentions weighing butter or selling reels of cotton than to pretend to be a minister of the gospel. That highlights the absolute sanctity he assigns to the proclamation of truth. There is no shame in secular labor. Selling cotton and weighing butter are honest, honorable professions that contribute to society.
Right, there's dignity in normal work.
Absolutely. But pretending to speak on behalf of God when your heart is not in it is a massive offense. It creates disgust in the hearers because it trivializes the eternal state of their souls. If you are going to speak for God, you must be thoroughly sincere, or else you should remain silent and find another line of work entirely.
Apply that to modern life. Outside of a 19th century pulpit, we see this exact dynamic constantly in the corporate world or in politics or with online influencers. People have a highly tuned radar for inauthenticity. When a CEO reads a corporate apology off a teleprompter, using all the correct PR jargon but their eyes are dead and their tone is flat, the public instantly rejects it. The words are right, but the sincerity is absent.
The public sees right through it every single time.
Spurgeon is saying that if a corporate apology fails without sincerity, how much more will the eternal truths of the gospel fail to land if the person speaking them sounds like they are reading a grocery list?
That is a brilliant modern parallel. Humans are exceptionally good at detecting a lack of conviction. We look for microexpressions, tone of voice, and body language to confirm if the words match the internal state of the speaker. In the context of Reformed theology, where we believe we are handling the very words of life, speaking them without evident sincerity is almost a form of blasphemy. It communicates to the listener that the subject matter is not actually true, or at least not true enough to affect the person talking about it. The hearer concludes, "If this does not move you, why should it move me?" Sincerity is the bridge of trust over which the truth must travel.
That requirement for internal conviction leads perfectly into the third qualification in our deep dive. Spurgeon takes sincerity and adds intense emotional weight to it. We move from evident sincerity to evident earnestness. Sincerity means you believe it, but earnestness means you feel the overwhelming, heavy reality of it. Here's where it gets really interesting, because Spurgeon shares a vague comparison using the physics of preaching.
I love this part of the lecture.
He uses the imagery of artillery. He asks the audience to imagine someone giving him a 100-pound cannonball and letting him simply roll it across the floor of the room. Then he contrasts that with a tiny rifle bullet, but one that is actually fired from a gun. The outcome, based purely on physics, is obvious.
The meaning behind that physical illustration is brilliant. The heavy 100-pound cannonball rolled across the floor represents a sermon full of massive, weighty theological words, perhaps delivered with perfect elocution and flawless grammar, but totally lacking in force or passion. It slowly bumps into the listener's foot and does absolutely nothing.
It just rolls to a stop.
Exactly. The small rifle bullet, however, represents a simple truth, perhaps a very basic presentation of grace, but one that is driven home by the intense emotion, conviction, and earnestness of the speaker. Because it is fired with extreme force, it pierces the heart. Spurgeon notes that we should never despise the little bullet because very often that is the one that kills the sin and kills the sinner, leading to their spiritual rebirth. The size of the vocabulary does not decide the outcome, the force of the delivery does.
Let us stay on the physics for a second. Force equals mass times acceleration. A massive vocabulary with zero emotional acceleration generates zero impact. But a tiny word, accelerated by genuine, burning earnestness, hits with devastating force. He takes the artillery metaphor even further with an incredible historical story. He recounts the tale of a fort that was firing its cannons on an enemy ship.
This is a wild story.
The fort was landing direct hits, but absolutely no damage was occurring to the vessel. The cannonballs were just bouncing off the thick wooden hull or causing minor dents. Then the general in command gave a specific order, make the cannonballs red hot before firing them. They did. They fired the red-hot shot, and the enemy vessel caught fire and was sent to the bottom of the sea in 3 minutes. Spurgeon uses this to tell preachers what they must do with their words. They have to make them red-hot.
He is telling them to fireball on Sundays, not snowball. He exhorts his students to hurl grenades and throw red-hot shot into the enemy's ranks. This speaks to the absolute necessity of emotional intensity. We are not dealing with trivial matters. We are not discussing the weather or giving a dry lecture on mathematics. The stakes require this high level of heat.
The highest possible stakes.
As Spurgeon points out, the Christian is dealing with an earnest Savior, an earnest heaven, and an earnest hell. When you consider that you are speaking to immortal souls about eternal pardon or eternal consequences, a lack of earnestness is an anomaly. A preacher without earnestness in the face of these realities must have a heart of stone, not a heart of flesh.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, in a practical sense? Think about pitching an idea at work that you genuinely believe will save the company from a disastrous mistake. If you walk into the conference room and casually read a spreadsheet in a monotone voice, your colleagues will ignore you. But if you stand up, look them in the eye, and speak with the undeniable urgency of someone who sees a cliff approaching, they will listen. The facts are the same, but the earnestness demands attention. Spurgeon applies this exact standard to handling the gospel. You cannot talk about rescue operations with the same tone you use to order a cup of coffee.
That urgency is the direct result of understanding what is at stake. In a reformed understanding, we know that the natural human heart is hard and resistant to the truth. We need God to break through that hardness. The earnestness of the speaker is often the very instrument God uses to capture the attention of that hard heart. If a person speaks with a casual, indifferent tone about matters of life and death, the listener's natural defense mechanisms will dismiss the message as irrelevant. Earnestness signals to the listener's brain that something vital is happening. It cuts through the noise of everyday life and demands a hearing.
The progression here in Spurgeon's logic is fascinating. We have instruction, sincerity, and earnestness. But earnestness without affection can easily become harsh. If you were just firing red-hot cannonballs all day, you might end up burning down the people you're trying to save. So Spurgeon introduces the next vital characteristic in Section 4, evident love for the hearers. This is where he warns against the danger of vitriol.
This is such a necessary warning.
He describes the absurd habit some ministers have of practically abusing their own congregations from the pulpit. He gives the example of a preacher who chose the parable of the Good Samaritan as his text. This preacher read the verse, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, and then immediately used it to attack his listeners, saying, 'I know another man who did come to this place and fell among thieves.'"
It is a stunning misuse of the platform. Spurgeon points out the sheer absurdity of raving at the people you are supposed to be shepherding. Think about the psychology of a leader who uses their position to constantly attack the people under their care. It usually stems from deep insecurity or a fundamental misunderstanding of their role.
They see the audience as the enemy.
Precisely. Spurgeon makes the very practical observation that even dogs and cats love the people who love them, and human beings operate on a very similar emotional frequency. If you are constantly throwing vitriol and emptying vials of wrath over your audience, you guarantee your own failure. The listeners will shut down. A cold man, one who seems carved out of a block of marble, or a highly combative man, will never succeed in drawing souls to Christ, regardless of how accurate his theology might be.
Imagine doing that in a modern setting. Imagine a manager standing up in a Monday morning meeting and saying, "We are going to talk about teamwork today." Which is funny because looking around this room, I see nothing but a bunch of selfish thieves who steal company time. That manager might have accurate data on low productivity, but they have completely destroyed any chance of actually leading those people to a better outcome. Spurgeon contrasts that kind of cold, attacking behavior with a beautiful description of a minister named Dr. Brock. Spurgeon describes him as a man having a great big heart. He compares this kind of minister to the harbor at Portsmouth or Plymouth.
The imagery of the harbor is brilliant. A harbor is a massive, safe enclosure. The waters outside might be chaotic, violent, and threatening, but once a ship enters the harbor, it can cast its anchor and feel completely protected under the lee of a great rock. Spurgeon is saying that the messenger of the truth must be that kind of safe space for the listener. Men succeed in this work precisely in proportion to how large their hearts are. You have to be a great heart if you want to lead pilgrims to the celestial city, which is a wonderful reference to John Bunyan's famous character in Pilgrim's Progress. A great heart fights off the giants and the lions to protect the weak pilgrims under his care. He does not attack the pilgrims himself.
To highlight the necessity of this large-hearted humanity, Spurgeon examines the opposite extreme. He describes meeting certain perfect brethren. These were men who gave off the appearance of living an entirely sinless, ascetic life, but they lacked all human warmth. They were unapproachable. Spurgeon humorously compares them to old bits of leather or pieces of seaweed. There was no humanity in them, no empathy, no shared struggle. They just sat up on a pedestal of perceived perfection.
This brings up a massive theological point regarding the incarnation. The Lord Jesus Christ did not shun human nature. He took it on. He joined his divine nature to human nature and elevated it. He wept. He ate with sinners. He experienced fatigue and sorrow. Ministers, therefore, must be men among men. They must mingle with their people in perfect love and sympathy. They cannot live as isolated hermits in a state of self-absorption, looking down their noses at the struggles of ordinary people.
They have to get their hands dirty in real life.
That is it. They must embody the mandate given by the Apostle Paul, who said he became all things to all men, that he might by all means save some. If you present yourself as a piece of flawless leather, no one will ever bring their brokenness to you.
We see that seaweed personality outside the church all the time, do we not? Think about the coworker who is technically brilliant, who never makes a mistake on a spreadsheet, but who is completely devoid of empathy. If you're going through a personal crisis, you do not go to the seaweed coworker. You go to the person with the Portsmouth Harbor heart, the person who actually cares about you. Spurgeon is insisting that truth must be delivered through the conduit of genuine human affection. If the listener does not feel loved by the speaker's words will just bounce off.
Right. And moving from evident love, Spurgeon tackles a deeply practical and related issue in Section 5, evident unselfishness. Love focuses on the other person, while unselfishness requires the active denial of your own ego and your own gain. He focuses heavily on the trap of self-seeking, specifically looking at the ruinous nature of greed. He states plainly that a man ceases to be effective the moment he becomes known as a selfish individual. Selfishness is something that cannot be hidden. It manifests itself at the dinner table, in the way a person handles disputes, and certainly in how they view their compensation. Spurgeon warns his students about seeking money and salary, stating they should be content with basic food and raiment.
I have to push back a little on that, or at least ask for some nuance. When Spurgeon says a minister should be content with basic food and clothes, is he demanding literal poverty? In his day, perhaps the economic structures were different, but in the modern world, how practical is that for someone trying to raise a family and pay a mortgage? Does he mean the messenger must take a vow of poverty, or is he talking about a posture of the heart?
That is a very fair question. We have to look at the broader context of Spurgeon's own life and the Reformed view of work. Spurgeon himself was not destitute, his writings sold millions of copies, and he managed a large staff. He is not advocating for a monastic vow of poverty. He is attacking the motivation of greed. He is targeting the person who enters the ministry or any form of spiritual leadership, looking at it as a lucrative career path or a way to enrich themselves. The posture of the heart must be one of contentment. If the primary driver of your decisions is how much money you can extract from a situation, your congregation will sense that you view them as customers rather than as souls under your care.
He highlights an interesting paradox regarding this issue of compensation. Spurgeon explains that the act of eagerly grabbing and grasping for money usually results in losing it entirely. People resent a greedy leader and will withhold their support. However, if a person tries to put the thought of money away from them and focuses entirely on the spiritual task at hand, pouring themselves out for the good of others, the money often comes back to them doubled, because people gladly support someone who genuinely cares for them.
The application extends far beyond just financial compensation. Selfishness is a multifaceted disease. Those who are selfish with money will inevitably be selfish in other areas. They will want all the glory for themselves. They will dominate conversations. They will refuse to share credit for a successful project. In a spiritual context, they will view the success of others not as a victory for the kingdom, but as a direct threat to their own standing and prestige.
He illustrates this ego-driven selfishness with the ugly trait of ministerial jealousy. He describes a pastor who hears about a massive revival at a neighboring church where many souls are being saved. Instead of rejoicing that good things are happening, the selfish minister reacts with a sneer. He questions the validity of the neighboring revival, asking where those converts will be in a few months' time. This selfish individual values his own tiny gain, perhaps one single new member added to his own church in a year, far more than a neighbor's massive success of adding 100 members. It is the completely self-centered, territorial view of the world.
Spurgeon draws out a core lesson from this behavior, stating a universal rule of human perception. The less a person thinks of themselves, the more others will respect them. Conversely, the more a person demands that people bow down and recognize their greatness, the less people will actually think of them. If someone decides they are going to be a great leader and they are willing to thrust others aside, steal credit, and sneer at the success of their peers to achieve that status, they will ruin their own usefulness. Any trace of selfishness must be eradicated. The people you are trying to reach will see the self-seeking motives and will immediately discount your message, assuming you are only speaking to them to build your own empire.
Apply that to the modern corporate ladder. We all know the manager who takes credit for their team's late-night hard work to secure their own promotion while throwing their peers under the bus. That manager might get the corner office, but they have lost all moral authority. No one will ever follow them out of loyalty, only out of fear or obligation. Spurgeon is saying that in the realm of communicating eternal truths, moral authority is everything. You cannot be a selfish credit stealer and a messenger of grace at the same time. The two realities cancel each other out.
That requirement for internal purity and moral authority brings us to section 6 of our deep dive, where Spurgeon discusses holiness of character and seriousness of manner. He starts with the absolute necessity of living the message. It is entirely useless to talk about a higher spiritual life on Sundays if you are living a lower, carnal, compromised life on the weekdays. The character must match the sermon. The private life must validate the public proclamation. He even advises abstaining from perfectly lawful things if engaging in them would cause weak members of the flock to stumble. When people see that a speaker is genuinely holy, they are drawn to the holy things being preached by the sheer force of the speaker's character.
Okay, but when we say holy and serious, people often picture someone who is miserable. Spurgeon addresses this directly, making a brilliant distinction between true seriousness and artificial melancholy. And he shares one of the funniest anecdotes in the entire lecture. He talks about a conversation overheard in a railway carriage. A passenger was comparing the physical appearance of a certain Catholic cardinal to Charles Spurgeon himself. The passenger noted that the cardinal looked like a skeleton, and he attributed this lean, ascetic appearance to long fasting, prayer, and immense holiness. This passenger then criticized Spurgeon, noting that Spurgeon ate and drank like an ordinary mortal, and therefore the passenger felt Spurgeon's preaching was worthless compared to the cardinal's.
The setup is perfect because it captures the common human misconception that physical misery equals spiritual depth. We tend to think that if someone looks gaunt and sad, they must be very close to God. But the friend of this passenger delivers an incredible punchline. He quietly asks if it ever struck the man that the cardinal's lean, skeletal appearance might simply be because his liver was out of order. He concluded that it was not grace making the cardinal so lean, but a medical issue.
Wait, so this guy on the train actually looked at this incredibly revered fasting cardinal and just casually said, nah, he just got a bad liver. That is brutal and hilarious.
It is brilliant. Spurgeon uses this hilarious story to analyze certain brethren who are naturally of a melancholy disposition. You know the type. They never laugh, they think it is wicked to smile, and they go about increasing the misery of the world with their gloomy faces. Spurgeon points out that this kind of unnecessary melancholy is not a sign of grace. It is just a bad liver, either physically or metaphorically. These overly sour individuals pour buckets of cold water on human joy. Spurgeon strongly warns against confusing a miserable disposition with true spiritual seriousness. God is the author of joy, and a messenger of good news should look like they actually believe the news is good.
However, Spurgeon balances that humor with a deeply tragic story to illustrate why a prevailing seriousness of manner is a strict necessity. He tells the story of a minister called to the deathbed of a young man. The young man reveals that years ago he walked home with this very minister after a church service. The young man had been deeply convicted by the sermon he just heard and was on the verge of giving his heart to Christ. He wanted to speak to the minister about his soul during the walk home. He was ready for a life-altering conversation.
But the minister ruined it. The moment they left the church, the minister cracked a joke. All the way back, the minister made fun of serious subjects and displayed total levity. The dying young man confessed that this joking behavior thoroughly disgusted him with religion and all who professed it. Because of that light-hearted, inappropriate banter, the young man suppressed his spiritual concern. The young man tells the minister that he is now dying, rejecting religion, and he places the blame squarely on the minister's levity, saying his blood will lie at the minister's door. It is a fatal joke.
That is a devastating narrative. The contrast between the humor of the liver story and the tragedy of fatal joke is jarring, but it makes the point perfectly. Timing is everything. There is a time to laugh at absurdity, but when dealing with someone's eternal soul, careless levity is destructive. The severe consequence of that ill-timed joke was the loss of an immortal soul. While Spurgeon advocates for cheerfulness and warns against artificial melancholy, he draws a hard line against levity that mocks sacred things. There must be prevailing seriousness about the Christian life. If you preach about eternal consequences in the pulpit, but treat everything as a massive joke at the supper table, the listeners will assume the sermon was just an act. The message will be destroyed by the messenger's casual attitude outside the church doors.
This careful balancing act, being cheerful but serious, bold but loving, continues into our final section, which contrasts tenderness with pugnacious behavior. Spurgeon begins by reviewing the concept of holy boldness. He offers advice to young preachers, telling them never to apologize for their youth or for attempting to speak the truth. A messenger of the gospel is an ambassador sent by a monarch. You do not apologize when delivering a message with the authority of the king behind you. He says the preacher is simply a trumpet of ram's horn. It does not matter if the horn was pulled off the ram yesterday or 25 years ago. If God blows through it, there will be noise. Therefore, speak out straight, but do it with extreme tenderness.
This is where the art of reproof comes into play.
Yeah.
Delivering unpalatable truths is a stern necessity for anyone who cares about others. People must be warned about their blind spots and their sin, but there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. This Spurgeon gives a brilliant analogy. He says, one method of correction is like kicking a man downstairs in such a skillful fashion that the man actually likes it.
I love that image. It implies that the correction is firm. You are moving the person from one place to another, but the delivery is so deft, so filled with genuine care, that the person receiving the correction feels grateful rather than attacked. The other method Spurgeon describes is opening a door for someone in such an offensive, nasty way that the person refuses to walk through it until you are completely out of sight. The door is open, the truth is available, but your behavior is so repulsive that the person rejects the safe passage simply because they despise you. Truth must be spoken, but it must be wrapped in the kindest possible form so that the listener is drawn to the truth rather than repelled by the delivery.
To illustrate the absolute wrong way to do this, Spurgeon describes the pugnacious preacher. He references the Irish one at Donnybrook Fair and a notorious street preacher on Clapham Common. These were places historically known for brawls and public fights. These are men who communicate as if they are prize fighters. They are never happy unless they are pitching into somebody, causing fights, rows, and setting everyone by the ears. If you let them into heaven, they would probably start a fight with the angels over the seating arrangements. They confuse being combative with being faithful.
That combative spirit leads Spurgeon to introduce one of the most devastating metaphors in the entire lecture, the spiritual ship scuttler. He describes a certain type of minister who goes from church to church, leaving absolute ruin behind him. This man arrives at a church, looks around, decides it needs to be purified, and begins his destructive work. The first thing he does is drive out the principal deacon. Next, he drives away all the leading families. He bores holes into the planks of the vessel under the guise of making it more holy. Just as the church is about to sink under the weight of his divisive, combative behavior, he slips off, boards another church vessel, and repeats the exact same process of destruction.
Think about the psychology of that kind of person. They actually believe they are doing a good thing. They think their harshness is a sign of uncompromising truth. But Spurgeon says this man's presence is like the spot where the foot of the Tartar's horse is put down the grass. Never grows there again. It is a terrifying description of a contentious, bitter spirit. He scorches the earth and calls it a purified garden. To combat this toxic mindset, Spurgeon mentions a legend about Muhammad. The story goes that an angel came and squeezed 2 black drops of sin out of his heart. Spurgeon urges his students to pray that God would squeeze the malice, ill will, and bad temper out of their own hearts before they even attempt to interact with others.
He anticipates an objection here from someone who might say, but we must set things right. We cannot let people tread on us. I see a problem, and I am going to take the bull by the horns. Spurgeon replies that taking a bull by the horns is the action of a fool, because the bull is highly likely to project you into space. He points out the folly of putting a mad bull into a china shop with the intention of getting the china cleaned. You cannot use a display of evil temper to set right anything that is wrong in a church, a family, or a business. The strict rule is that truth must always be spoken in love, especially when rebuking sin. The ship scuttler destroys the very thing he claims to be saving because he lacks tenderness.
As we draw this discussion to a close, let us summarize the atmosphere Spurgeon is calling for. Winning souls is not just about having a high IQ or the right theological definitions mapped out on a whiteboard. It requires an entire atmosphere permeated with these specific human characteristics. The messenger must possess comprehensive knowledge to light the candle, evident sincerity to avoid the actor's trap, red-hot earnestness to pierce the heart, a Portsmouth Harbor-sized love to provide safe refuge, complete unselfishness, genuine holiness paired with cheerfulness, prevailing seriousness, and a tender spirit that refuses to scuttle the ship.
And this brings the application directly back to you, the listener. You may not be a vocational pastor standing in a pulpit on Sundays, but you do communicate truth in your daily interactions. You interact with coworkers, family members, neighbors, and friends. How do these historical stringent qualifications challenge the way you speak to them? Are you rolling a cold, 100-pound cannonball of correct doctrine at your teenager? Or are you firing a small, red-hot bullet of earnest, loving truth? Are you acting like the pugnacious street fighter in your staff meetings, or are you the safe harbor? The Reformed tradition insists that God alone changes the heart, but it also insists that God uses the specific tone, manner, and character of the speaker as the means to accomplish that divine work. Your character is the wrapping paper on the gift of the gospel.
I want to leave you with a final thought to consider, something that springs directly from this text, but shifts the perspective entirely. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at the immense responsibility of the messenger. We have placed a heavy burden on the person doing the speaking. But if our human manner, our sincerity, earnestness, and tenderness can so heavily dictate whether divine truth is accepted or rejected, what is the responsibility of the hearer? Are we, as listeners, permanently bound by the flawed human packaging of the message? Or is there a duty for us to look past a ship scuttler, to look past the bad temper, the awkward delivery, or the lack of earnestness, and actively fight to find the truth hidden beneath the flawed human exterior? If the messenger fails to be the perfect Portsmouth harbor, do we have an obligation to drop anchor anyway? It is a question that requires intense self-reflection the next time you sit under the teaching of the Word, or the next time someone offers you an unpalatable truth. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.